Hello, this is Brother Kerma from the Math Department, and this is a supplement of the videos dealing with inference for two means independent samples. And the supplement is dealing with SPSS commands. And so what we're going to talk about is the four types of commands that you'll need to do independent samples in SPSS. First is histograms. Now you've done this before, but there'll be a different twist. There's the explore command, same type of deal, but there will be a slightly different twist. We'll be doing something which is called recoding, and then we'll wrap it up with independent samples. So first of all, let's talk about histograms. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this data. This is the developmental, this is the data represent the number of days each week that children with developmental problems, and so the DEV group is the developmental group, and the children without developmental problems, the gen group. So here's the developmental group here. As you go further down, you will see the generation group here. So what we're going to do is that we're going to compare these two groups first by doing a histogram. So I'm going to take the measured variable, which is nights per week reading, and I'll put that in the variable here. You've done that before, but now what we have to do is we have to take the group variable, and now we want to separate our histogram by the two groups. So we can either put it in the rows box or the column box. If we put it in the rows box, we have something that looks like this, where the histograms are stacked one on top of the other. If we do it to where we have the grouping variable in the columns box, then we have side by side. Okay, now my own preference is that I prefer to stack one on top of the other because it's easier to compare the distributions, both the shape and the spread of these distributions. Okay, so then the next item I want to talk about is the explore commands or options in SPSS. So I'm going to go to Analyze Descriptive Statistics Explore. I'll take the measured variable and I'll put that in the dependent list, which is what you've done before. But now I'm going to take the group variable and now I'm going to put it in the factor list. This is what's going to allow us to separate out our information between the developmental group and the general group. But then I'll do a couple more things which you've done before. I can create histograms here as well as normality plots with tests, which allows me to do QQ plots. Now, if you tried earlier, I know some of you use the what's called the QQ plot command in SPSS. If you try to do it now with two groups, it will not work. So use the explore command when you're going through this. Okay. So now, if you click on OK, then you'll get a whole bunch of output. And divided by the two groups, you have the developmental group and the generation group with all the different output. Here are the two histograms divided between the two groups. You also have, if I go further down, here's the QQ plots. Here's the QQ plot for the developmental group, and then the QQ plot for the generation group. And then at the very bottom, we have the box plots side by side. Okay. So then the next item is the recoding. Now the reason why we do recoding is because if we have a string variable, this is what a string variable is where you have letters instead of numbers. Now, there's several ways to do this here, but basically, if you have a string variable which is a width of, in this case, which is more than 8, this one is 300, then we're going to have to use the automatic recode. Okay, so what I recommend to you is to do what's called transform automatic recode. And so I'm going to take the group variable and put that here. Okay, and I'm going to create a new name. I'm just going to call it GRP Recode. I think that'll work. And then add new name, and then click on OK. And then when you do that, you'll get a new column. Okay. Now we're going to use this column to do the next item, which is the independent samples t-test in SPSS. Okay. So let's get to that. So that'll be the last thing, which is the independent samples t-test. Now let me show you. If I do analyze, compare means, independent samples t-test. So I'll put in the nights per week reading. That's the test variable that goes here. If I decide to put in this original variable here, the group variable, and I define groups, and if I remember right, it's DEV. DEV is how you define the first group. If I type that in DEV, and then the second group is GEN, click on Continue and click on OK, it'll give you this results. Okay, because the string variable is too long. Anything beyond 8 is too much. Okay. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to do analyze, compare means, independent samples t-test. And instead of using the group variable, I'm going to put that back over here. I'm going to use the recode variable. And I'm going to define groups now by just saying 1 and 2 because that's what's displayed here. How you define the groups is based off of how it's displayed here in the output. In fact, if I go down here, here's 1, and you go further down, you'll see 2. So the two groups on this variable is defined by 1 and 2. So if I do analyze, compare means, independent samples t-test, I'll pull this out here. I'll put in the group Recode here, and I define them groups by 1 and 2. Click on Continue and click on OK, and then there's my output. That'll give you your output. This gives you your test statistic, degrees of freedom, and p-value. This is the p-value. This is a two-sided test, but if it's a one-sided test, then you take that number, divide it in half, and then this is where you get your confidence interval. You always use the bottom row. Equivariance is not assumed when it comes to dealing with SPSS, because equivariance is not assumed. It is always correct. Okay, and that concludes the videos dealing with SPSS for inference for two means independent samples.